There's a moment happening right now, somewhere, in the mind of the man you finally walked away from. A moment he will never post about, never mention to the people who still think he's fine, never admit to anyone, including, in his more defended hours, himself. He is not fine. If you've heard fragments of this already, a mutual friend mentioning he seems off lately, a strange late-night message that made no sense given how confident he seemed the last time you saw him, a social media presence that looks busier but somehow emptier than before. You've been catching glimpses of something real. Not performance this time. Not a tactic engineered to pull you back. Something closer to genuine unraveling, the kind we've traced carefully across many previous conversations, finally reaching a threshold where the usual defenses can no longer fully contain it. Today we're going to walk through exactly what this looks like, why it's happening now specifically, and why understanding it matters far less for satisfying curiosity about him, and far more for finally, completely releasing you from the last threads of doubt that might still occasionally whisper, "Did I imagine how much this relationship meant, or mattered, or cost?" Let's start with why this collapse, if it's genuinely happening, is arriving now rather than earlier, because the timing itself reveals something crucial. Remember everything we've established about how a narcissist's psychological architecture depends on external structures for stability, validation, admiration, a reliable audience willing to reflect back whatever version of himself he needs reflected. For a significant stretch of time after you left, this architecture typically survives on borrowed structure. The story he tells himself and others about why the relationship ended, the temporary stabilization of new attention or new relationships, the simple passage of time, allowing him to avoid direct confrontation with what actually happened. Collapse, when it genuinely occurs, tends to arrive once these borrowed structures finally, individually, fail to hold. This is rarely a single dramatic event. It's an accumulation, the new relationship that didn't provide the stabilization he expected, the friends who've grown quieter around him, the mounting evidence that his usual tools simply aren't producing the same results they once did with you specifically. Each failure alone might be manageable. Together, compounding over months, they create exactly the kind of systemic overwhelm that produces genuine breakdown rather than the temporary discomfort we've discussed in earlier, more contained forms of narcissistic distress. Here's what this actually looks like from the outside, in the fragments that occasionally reach you, if they reach you at all. Sleep disruption significant enough that people around him notice. A previously reliable competence at work or in daily functioning that started uncharacteristically to slip. Emotional volatility that seems to arrive without clear external trigger. Sudden irritability. Sudden withdrawal. Sudden intensity in situations that wouldn't have provoked this response before. None of this looks dramatic in any single instance. It accumulates into something that people who know him well describe almost universally, using some version of the same phrase. He doesn't seem like himself. This phrase deserves careful examination because it's more accurate than the people using it probably realize. What they're actually witnessing is the erosion of the performed self, the confident, capable, charming persona he's maintained for years, sometimes decades, revealing glimpses of something underneath that persona was specifically built to conceal. Remember what we discussed extensively in our conversation about narcissistic breakdown following permanent loss. The way regulatory outsourcing, narrative infrastructure, and predictive competence all depend, quietly and invisibly, on structures he never had to build independently, because someone else, usually you, was providing them without either of you fully naming what was actually happening. When those structures finally, completely fail to find adequate replacement, what surfaces underneath isn't simply sadness about losing you specifically. It's a genuine confrontation with an internal emptiness his entire adult life was organized around avoiding. Here's what makes this specific collapse different from the more contained forms of distress we've examined in earlier conversations, the kind that typically resolves through supply diversification or narrative reconstruction. Sometimes, for reasons that vary from person to person, the specific severity of the underlying wound, the absence of any adequate replacement source, sheer bad timing that compounds multiple stressors simultaneously. These usual resolution mechanisms simply don't work quickly enough or completely enough to prevent the crisis from deepening rather than dissipating. This is when we see something closer to genuine sustained collapse, distinct from the temporary crisis we've discussed as a normal, expected stage in the aftermath of significant loss. What does this deeper collapse typically involve, and why does understanding it matter for you specifically, even though the temptation is strong to simply feel validated and move on without examining it further? Because there's important nuance here worth sitting with honestly. The first thing worth understanding is that genuine psychological collapse, even in someone whose behavior caused you significant harm, is still genuine human suffering. This distinction matters, and it's worth naming directly rather than glossing past it in favor of pure vindication. You can hold two things simultaneously without contradiction: clear-eyed understanding that his suffering doesn't erase or excuse what he did to you, and simple human acknowledgement that watching or hearing about someone's genuine psychological deterioration isn't something that requires celebration in order to also not require your intervention. This distinction protects you from two equally unhelpful extremes. The first extreme involves manufacturing coldness you don't actually feel, forcing yourself into a performance of complete indifference, specifically because you believe this is what healing requires, even when some genuine, complicated human feeling about his suffering naturally arises. The second extreme involves the trap we've discussed throughout multiple previous conversations: allowing genuine compassion to reactivate the caretaking instinct that kept you trapped for so long, mistaking his collapse for an invitation, a signal that finally now, your intervention might produce the transformation you once hoped for. Neither extreme actually serves you. What serves you is something more nuanced: acknowledging whatever genuine human feeling arises, without requiring that feeling to translate into any action at all. You can feel something complicated upon hearing he's genuinely struggling, and you can simultaneously understand, with complete clarity, that this feeling doesn't obligate you to anything whatsoever. Here's what's crucial to understand about why this collapse, even when genuine, still shouldn't function as the validation you might be seeking, the proof that finally, retroactively justifies everything you experienced. Remember something we traced carefully throughout our conversation about the real reason a narcissist you left is breaking down. The structures collapsing inside him were never actually about you specifically, in the sense of your unique, irreplaceable individual qualities. They're about the loss of a function, a role, a source of regulation his own psychological architecture never developed independent capacity to provide. His collapse confirms significance in terms of structural dependence. It doesn't necessarily confirm the kind of love, the kind of genuine appreciation for who you actually were, that would make this collapse feel like the validation it might initially seem to offer. This distinction matters enormously because there's a specific trap waiting inside news of a narcissist's genuine collapse, one worth naming directly because it's subtle enough to slip past without recognition. It's easy to interpret his suffering as proof that the relationship and your own investment in it was more real, more significant, more worth everything it cost you than you've allowed yourself to believe during the difficult work of moving forward. This interpretation feels good, understandably so, after years of being told, directly or indirectly, that you were the unstable one, the difficult one, the one whose emotions were too much. But his collapse doesn't actually prove this. It proves something narrower and more clinical: that his psychological structure depended heavily on functions you provided, and that losing access to those functions without adequate replacement produced exactly the kind of destabilization we've traced across multiple previous conversations. This is worth understanding clearly, not to diminish your own experience, but to protect you from building your own sense of closure on a foundation that was never actually designed to hold the weight of full, complete validation. There's something else worth understanding here, something that addresses a specific fear that often accompanies hearing about a narcissist's genuine collapse. The fear that this collapse somehow makes you responsible, that leaving him, staying gone, maintaining the boundaries that allowed this collapse to occur, constitutes some kind of harm you're now accountable for. This fear deserves direct, clear address because it's genuinely common and genuinely worth dismantling completely. This fear deserves direct, clear address because it's genuinely common and genuinely worth dismantling completely, not with a quick reassurance you're meant to simply accept, but with the same careful reasoning we've applied throughout this entire conversation. Here's the actual truth about responsibility in this situation, examined honestly rather than simply asserted. You are not responsible for his collapse, and understanding exactly why requires separating two things that get easily, damagingly conflated: the difference between causing someone's distress and declining to continue absorbing it on their behalf. You didn't do anything to him. You simply stopped doing something for him. Specifically, stopped providing the regulatory function, the narrative audience, the predictable responsiveness that his own psychological architecture never developed independent capacity to generate. This is fundamentally different from harm, even though the outcome, his genuine suffering, might look similar from a distance. Think about this through an analogy worth sitting with carefully. If someone has spent years leaning their entire physical weight against a wall that was never actually designed to bear that weight, and the wall finally, eventually, gives way, the wall didn't cause the fall. The wall simply reached the limit of what it could reasonably be expected to hold indefinitely. You were never actually a wall built specifically to bear his psychological weight in the first place. You were a person, someone with your own needs, your own limits, your own right to eventually stop providing support that was never fairly reciprocated, regardless of how long that support had continued or how thoroughly he'd come to depend on it. This means his collapse, however genuine, however difficult it might be to witness even from a distance, was never actually something you did to him. It's something that happened once you stopped absorbing consequences that were never yours to carry, revealing a structural weakness that existed long before you ever left, one that your continued presence had simply, temporarily, been concealing. Here's what actually matters now, more than understanding the mechanics of his collapse in exhaustive detail: what you do with this information moving forward, and how you protect yourself from the specific traps this kind of news tends to create. The first thing worth doing, if you find yourself receiving fragments of this information through mutual connections or indirect channels, is examining honestly what function continuing to receive and process this information actually serves in your own life right now. Sometimes, early in the healing process, some engagement with this information provides genuine, useful confirmation, proof that your perception throughout the relationship was accurate, evidence that helps solidify your own understanding of what actually happened. This can be legitimately useful, especially if you're still working through residual self-doubt about your decision to leave. But there's a point, one worth honestly identifying for yourself, where continued engagement with updates about his collapse stops serving your healing and starts functioning as exactly the kind of ongoing tether we've cautioned against throughout many previous conversations. If you find yourself actively seeking out this information, checking for updates, feeling a specific kind of anticipation or dread about what the next piece of news might reveal, this represents a meaningful shift worth noticing. It suggests the information has stopped confirming something you needed to know and started becoming something you're using to remain connected to him, even while telling yourself you've moved on completely. The second thing worth doing is preparing yourself, honestly and in advance, for the specific pull that genuine collapse often produces, even in people who feel completely certain about their decision to leave. Human compassion doesn't simply switch off because someone has hurt you, and there's nothing wrong with you if witnessing genuine suffering activates some instinct toward wanting to help, even towards someone who caused you significant harm. Preparing for this pull in advance, understanding that it's a normal human response rather than evidence of weakness or confused loyalty, allows you to experience it without immediately acting on it, without mistaking the presence of compassion for an obligation to intervene. The third thing worth doing, and this addresses something we've returned to throughout many of these conversations in different forms, is remembering clearly what actually happens if you do choose to intervene, even from a place of genuine, well-intentioned compassion. Remember what we traced extensively about how narcissistic psychology processes rescue, especially rescue that arrives without requiring any genuine accountability first. Your intervention wouldn't heal the underlying structural weakness that produced this collapse. It would simply pause the collapse temporarily, deferring the same reckoning to some future moment when your presence, once again, eventually becomes unavailable, whether through another departure or through the natural limits of what any single person can sustainably provide another human being indefinitely. This isn't cruelty. It's accurate understanding of what actually helps versus what simply delays genuine change, if genuine change is even possible for him at all. His collapse, uncomfortable as it might be to witness even from a distance, represents something his own psychological system genuinely needs to move through, using whatever internal resources he actually has available in order to develop any authentic capacity for self-regulation that doesn't depend entirely on someone else's continuous, unreciprocated labor. Here's what ultimately matters most about everything we've discussed today. The thing worth carrying forward long after the specific details of his current struggle fade into whatever comes next in both of your separate lives. His collapse, whether it resolves into genuine growth or simply into another cycle of temporary stabilization followed by eventual repeat crisis, was never actually the marker your own healing needed to wait for. You already know what you survived. You already understand, with whatever combination of clarity and hard-won peace you've built since leaving, exactly what happened and exactly what it cost you. You don't need his collapse to validate this understanding, and you don't need his eventual recovery, if it happens, to feel guilty about the boundaries that allowed his collapse to occur in the first place. Both of these, his suffering and his eventual outcome, whatever it turns out to be, belong entirely to his own separate journey, one that exists independently of your continued attention, your continued compassion, or your continued involvement in any form. So if you're currently receiving fragments of this news, wondering what it means, wondering whether it changes anything about your own path forward, understand this clearly. It doesn't have to change anything at all. You can hold whatever complicated human feeling arises upon hearing it, and you can simultaneously continue building the exact life you were already building before this news reached you, undisturbed and unrequired to shift course based on whatever he's currently experiencing on his own side of a separation you already correctly chose. His collapse belongs to him. Your peace, the one you fought so hard to finally reach, belongs entirely, permanently to you. And nothing happening inside his unraveling world requires you to set that peace down, even for a moment, in order to go check on wreckage that was never yours to rebuild in the first place.